Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. It's been a long couple of months since the Overwatch League Grand Finals and the wave of announcements that followed, marking the end of the league's 6-year run. Today I wanted to look back at one of the things that made the past 6 years of the Overwatch League special: Rivalries. Across every season, Rivalries drove the story of the Overwatch League. They were the games that mattered every time they were on the schedule, and often were games that were relevant to which team qualified for and competed in major tournaments. Now, for all 10 rivalries in this video, I relied on two major factors: competitiveness of their head-to-head series and the frequency of big games in the rivalry. I want to try to add a little bit of an objective side to this video, but it is still, of course, a subjective list, and how the data is interpolated and interpreted is going to differ from person to person. Many of the league's best rivalries existed for years, such as the Battle for Canada or the Battle for Texas, but others were single-season rivalries that had incredible impact on the season that they occurred, such as with San Francisco and Vancouver in 2019. All of these rivalries are equally important to the history of the Overwatch League, so this list won't be favoring one over the other, but I will mention when a rivalry is single season or historic. Finally, as always, keep in mind that this is my list and my opinions, so feel free to let me know your thoughts on this list in the comments down below, and which rivalry you think is the greatest in Owl's history. With that out of the way, let's jump into it and look at my list of the top 10 rivalries in the Overwatch League's history. At number 10, I have the rivalry between the San Francisco Shock and the Philadelphia Fusion from the 2020 season. These two teams were, of course, the top two teams in the Western region in 2020, both of them competing really as the kind of big dogs in the league. And it was one of those things where in 2020, of course, the season was weird, it was odd, obviously COVID changed that season, and there was a lot of kind of a lot of variety in the performance of teams, but these two were the consistent factors throughout the season. They were both phenomenal teams, and there's certainly no reason to really criticize either of these teams, and they obviously were very exciting to watch. Ultimately, the reason why this one is as low on the list as it is because it was a very one-sided affair. They played 4 times in 2020, the Shock winning 3 of them, the Fusion only getting 1 win, and unfortunately for the Fusion, they were not able to win any of the major big games that they played. Of course, they played in the Countdown Cup Finals, the Shock managing to win that one, and then they also played again in the North America playoffs, or play-ins, to get into the main playoffs, and the Shock were victorious in that as well. Countdown Cup Finals were the only finals they played in. Philadelphia disappointed in the May Melee, and then Paris Eternal, of course, very, very good in the Summer Showdown, and were able to win that one over both the Shock and the Fusion. So it's a rivalry that had a lot of really good moments, a lot of really good games, and it was two really good teams, but just the lack of overall big moments from it is why I have it down at 10. But I thought it was a phenomenal rivalry. Two great teams every time they played, regardless of the scoreline. They were phenomenal games with just amazing players on both sides. At number 9, I have the Atlanta Reign and the Houston Outlaws from this past 2023 season. Similarly to the Shock and Fusion, it was a relatively one-sided rivalry, with the Reign winning 3 out of the 4 matches, including, of course, the 2 games that they played in the Mid-Season Madness, the upper bracket finals and the grand finals of that LAN tournament. But ultimately, the reason why I gave this rivalry the edge over that 2020 Shock one is that, to me, the matches that the Reign and Outlaws played in 2023 were just bigger. They were higher impact. Obviously, there's double elimination as opposed to the 2020 format, where a single elimination bracket, they just met in that finals, and that was the only game they played in that tournament. There was no kind of secondary, upper bracket, lower bracket type of situation there. But in addition to that, the Reign Outlaws upper bracket finals, not the grand finals, but the upper bracket finals in the Mid-Season Madness, was one of the greatest games of recent Overwatch League history. It was a phenomenal matchup. It's a little more recent in my mind, so it does get maybe a little bit of an edge for that. But I also think that the other thing I think is really interesting about this one, and the thing that ultimately gives it the edge over that Shock Fusion, is that the Fusion did get a win over the Shock after losing 2 games to the Shock. But then that was it. They didn't get that extra win. They didn't get the 1-up. And ultimately, at the end of the season, the Shock ended up winning the Grand Finals. There's an argument to be made that Houston, being the first team to beat Atlanta in 2023, was the beginning of the end for the Atlanta Reign. That the Atlanta Reign began to unravel a bit after they lost to the Outlaws. And it was that Outlaws team that ultimately made the Grand Finals. They did not come out, of course, victorious, but they didn't make the Grand Finals. They competed as best they could. They were able to beat the Hangzhou Spark team that the Reign struggled against and lost to. And so I think there's a little bit more of a narrative there that at the end of the day, the Reign may have been more victorious. They may have won the Midseason Madness. They may have won more of the games. So the Outlaws are the team at the end of the day that you can look at their playoff performance and feel a lot better about. And so I think there was a little bit more of a narrative to this rivalry in 2023 that really did give it a little bit more of a leg up. I still think it's not one of the all-time greats. Some great games. They only played 4 times, which hurts a little bit, but certainly that first half of 2023, this rivalry was incredible, and you can't really, in my opinion, discount it for what it was doing for the league in its final season. At number 8, I have the rivalry between the New York Excelsior and the Philadelphia Fusion. Shouting out the Fusion in this one instead of the Infernal because the New York Excelsior technically never played against the Seoul Infernal. They only played against the Philadelphia Fusion. And when you go back and you look at the history of these games, if my numbers are correct, it was an 8-5 advantage for the New York Excelsior against the Fusion. They played a total of 13 times, with New York winning 8 of the 13. And this rivalry, I think part of the reason why I don't have it higher on this list is because when you look at the trajectory of these teams, they were very interesting. You think back to 2018, which was really the pinnacle of this rivalry. They played a lot that season. I believe they played 7 times in 2018. They played once every stage, plus the Stage 2 playoffs, and then they played twice in the playoffs in general. So I believe they played a total of 7 times. So over half of their games were in 2018. And I think it was the rivalry of 2018 that for me as a New York Excelsior fan was the most interesting. And when you look at just the history, especially in 2018, right? New York, best team in the league for 4 out of the 4 stages straight, best record in the league by far. Stage 1, they're undefeated. They go up against the Fusion, and the Fusion hand them their first loss of the Overwatch League season. They meet again in Stage 2. New York manages to beat them then in their Stage 2 rematch. Stage 2 finals comes around. Fusion go up 2-0. New York has to reverse sweep to get that Stage 2 finals victory. A couple more wins under New York's belt in Stage 3. I believe they lost to Fusion, though, in Stage 4. And then you get to the playoffs. Philadelphia Fusion, the 6th seed, the underdog. No one expects them to do it. They 3-0 New York in the first game they play. They 3-2 them in the second game they play. Eliminate New York, the home team, essentially, if they make the grand finals in Brooklyn in front of their home crowd. Would have been this huge, massive moment for that team. And the Fusion knock them out, and they go on to play in the grand finals, ultimately falling to the London Spitfire. But I think this rivalry was a very strong rivalry in 2018 that I think still carried some of that steam going forward. 2019, it was one-sided. New York won both of their meetings that season. 2020, Philadelphia, they played one time. Philadelphia was able to win that one. 2021, last time we saw this rivalry with some games. They split, I believe it was either 2-1 or 1-1, somewhere in that ballpark. New York won a game. I know even the Fusion were arguably the better team. They were up and down a bit, but there was definitely some legs there, some history there with Jonak versus Carpe. It was a very interesting rivalry. I think it just is one of those rivalries that unfortunately doesn't have the same overall legs and impact on some of the biggest moments. They only have a handful of big games, all of them from 2018, and that's really what hurts this rivalry from being any higher on this list. But as a New York Excelsior fan, I've always viewed the Fusion as New York's primary rival. I think it was a very good rivalry, just a historic rivalry that really did last. You wished you could have seen more of it in 2022, 2023, and even 2020, when I think both of those teams were phenomenal. Only getting to see them play once was a little unfortunate, but I still think it's a very good rivalry, and that's why they are here at number 8. At number 7, I have the LA Gladiators and the Atlanta Reign in 2021. I think this is one of the most underrated rivalries in the history of the Overwatch League. One of the most underrated narratives in the history of the Overwatch League. These two teams, for almost all of 2021, were competing to be the second best team and arguably at times the best team in the Western region. Obviously, Dallas Fuel were at the top of the world at that point in time. Phenomenal team, one of the best in the world. They were fighting for that grand final spot. But the Gladiators were a team that were improving a lot throughout the season. And the Reign, very good team, kind of a dark horse team where they were better than people, I think, expected them to be a lot of the time. They matched up 5 times in 2021 with the Reign taking 3 out of the 5. But I think ultimately the thing that makes this rivalry so interesting to me is that 3 of their 5 games were really, really massive games. They were the Summer Showdown qualifiers where the Reign beat the Gladiators 3-2, knocking them out of the Summer Showdown. They met again a couple weeks later in the regular season in the Countdown Cup qualifiers. Reign won that one again 3-2. Then in the Countdown Cup proper, the main Countdown Cup event, they meet and the Gladiators get a win there 3-0. And then they meet again in the playoffs. Gladiators, one of the top teams in the league. People expect them to make it to the grand finals. And the Reign stopped them on their road to the grand finals. And I think this was a rivalry that just was very fun. It was very exciting. It was a lot of 3-2 games where you thought the Gladiators were going to do it. And the Reign pulled out that map 5. And you just felt like you could see the Gladiators get so close so often and just couldn't get over the line. It felt like the Reign had just that more clutch factor. But when the Gladiators won, it felt like they dominated. So it was a very interesting rivalry, a very interesting series. They produced, in my opinion, some of the best games in the history of the Overwatch League. I think neither of these teams were the best in the league. Reign obviously made the grand finals, but that was kind of a shock. People expected it to be Dallas versus Shanghai, and ultimately the Reign just managed to sneak their way in. Wasn't particularly competitive series when they made it. But it was one of those rivalries that was just personal. It was one of those ones where you felt that you could just see that the Gladiators wanted to win they just felt like they were just so close and the Reign kept getting in their way and the Reign wanted to prove that they were the better team over and over again. It was a very personal rivalry. It felt very good. It felt like a true traditional rivalry that doesn't feel like one that is, forced by like geography or region. It was, we are 2 teams that are very good and we keep having to play each other and we know we're in each other's way for our goals and we want to win because that is how it works. Phenomenal rivalry, phenomenal games. Love this one. It's here at number 7. At number 6, I have the Seoul Derby, Seoul Bowl, whatever you want to call it. Seoul Dynasty versus the Seoul Infernal, also including the history with the Philadelphia Fusion. These teams played a total of 19 times. It was a pretty one-sided affair with the Dynasty walking away from that series 13 out of the 19 times victorious. And a lot of the big games they played in, they did play in quite a few because they were in the same region for 2021, 2022, and 2023. Many of those big games went the way of the Seoul Dynasty. Arguably the biggest was in that 2020 playoffs where the underdog Dynasty knocked out the Fusion before then beating Shanghai and playing in the grand finals against the San Francisco Shock, which was a major, no pun intended, shock for all because most people expected Shanghai and San Francisco to meet in that grand finals. They would meet again in the 2021 Countdown Cup, Dynasty winning there. But in the play-ins in 2021, it was the Fusion that got the last laugh over a Dynasty team that people thought were good. They just did not have the momentum there that time around. Then it turned to a pretty one-sided Dynasty winning in 2022. Their matchups over and over again. Very good team in 2022 from the Dynasty. Dynasty's first ever tournament win was that 2022 kickoff clash over the Fusion. And then in 2023, the Dynasty in a down year were able to win the final meeting between these 2 teams, get the real final last laugh against the Infernal in that summer stage knockouts that the Dynasty would end up going on to win over O2 Blast. So it was a very interesting rivalry here. Lots of games. Even in the days of the Fusion, it was a very competitive series, a very fun series. History there. Profit versus Carpe for a lot of it was a big storyline from 2020 on. Just a really good rivalry that meant a lot, especially when you consider just the importance of South Korea to Overwatch as an esport, and just Seoul is the capital arguably of esports in general. And so getting to see those teams play in front of home crowds over and over again was really awesome. And I think it was a rivalry that had a lot of meaning throughout the years of two teams that were just good pretty consistently. And it made it one of the rivalries to really look out for as the league went on. So I think it really deserves a spot on this list. I think it's a little underrated. I think it definitely had some rougher moments, especially the first couple of years of the league where the dynasty just didn't perform incredibly well in 2018. 2019, they got a little better, but very good rivalry, especially if 2020, 2021, 2022. I think the rivalry really had some of its best moments. Rounding the corner into the top 5, I have the battle for Los Angeles, the battle for LA. What an interesting rivalry. It's a fun one to talk about because when you look at the history of the rivalry, it doesn't have the most big games when you consider tournaments, stuff like that. The only time they met in a big game was in that 2018 Stage 4 playoffs. Gladiators go in as the 1 seed. They pick the Valiant because they just lost to them, and they wanted to prove they could beat them, and the Valiant walked away from that one victorious 3-2. But for me, really, one of the things that makes this one so interesting was just how competitive it was and how long it lasted. You look back to 2018, Valiant 4-1 against the Gladiators in 2018. Won all but one of their matches in this rivalry in 2018. And then in 2019, the Gladiators won 2. And in 2020, they won 2. So they took the 4-5 advantage over the Valiant. Then the Valiant go to the Eastern region. They go, all this controversy. They're surrounded by tons of it. 2023, they meet for the 10th and final time. The Gladiators look like one of the best teams in the world, at least in the Western region. A little bit of a disappointing finish to the first half of the season for them, but still overall pretty good. Valiant yet to find a win at that point in the season. And a reverse sweep victory for the Valiant ties the series up all-time 5-5. And the Gladiator season was over from that point on. And the Valiant, they only won one other game, but they found newfound life. They looked better in the second half of the season. They really did start to impress. And it was a poetic end to the rivalry that really did set the tone in 2018. The rivalry at the Blizzard Arena in Los Angeles, the two teams that was always high energy, was always exciting. You don't have the success of the Overwatch League in 2018 and in 2019, in my opinion, without that rivalry, without the importance of that game every single time. All 5 times they played, it mattered. You had fans of the Valiant, fans of the Gladiators. It was intense. It was fun. It was such a good rivalry. It was such a good story. And I think you do not have what we know as the Overwatch League without it. It just doesn't exist without that rivalry. I think it's such an important part of Overwatch League's history, and I want to give it a shout out here at number 5. Bouncing back to 2021 for number 4, I have the Shanghai Dragons versus the Dallas Fuel. A rare instance here, and I believe the only one on this list where every single match between these two teams are what I consider big games, which of course, if you haven't picked up yet, those are tournament games, right? Tournament qualifiers, tournament finals, whatever it is. If they are games that are win or go home or win or get knocked to a lower bracket, those are the kinds of games that I have put here as big games. You can make an argument in that last one that the time that the Valiant played the Gladiators in 2019 at their homestand, where if they won, they could have moved on to the playoffs, was a big game. But I didn't include it. But this is one of those ones where every single game these teams played was a big game. They played in the May Melee twice, they played in the June Joust twice, and then they played in the playoffs. And this one's interesting to me because the win percentage actually favors the Fuel. They won the 2 meetings in the May Melee, the upper bracket finals. Actually, maybe an upper bracket round 1, but I believe it was the upper bracket finals and the grand finals of the May Melee. They met again in the June Joust, Fuel victorious in the first meeting. And then, of course, the grand finals where we got the birth of the Fate Wrecking Ball, where he was able to lead Shanghai to the victory there. From then on, the Dragons went on a tear throughout the rest of the season, winning the Countdown Cup, or the Summer Showdown. And then they met again in the playoffs where the Dragons were victorious before they won the grand final. So the Fuel won more of the games, but the Dragons got the last laugh. 2 really good teams. They were on a collision course the entire season to kind of meet in those big games, those big moments. I really do think when you look at just the way those teams played, you had phenomenal players. You had Fearless, who had been on Shanghai the year before, moves to Dallas, and in their first meeting, he gets the win. He gets the last laugh. He gets to say, I believed that this was the move for me, and look who won. But then at the end of the day, the Dragons got the last laugh because they had the versatility of Fate. They had the really solid all-around performances of players on that roster. Obviously, Fuel would go on to win the Overwatch League the next season, and the Dragons would have a bit more of a disappointing run. But in 2021, these were the two best teams in the world. It was phenomenal. It was back and forth. And like I said, every single game they played mattered. They were competitive pretty regularly, pretty consistently. And I just think you don't get stuff like that a lot. You wanted to see the same thing in 2020. You would have hoped that's what we got with San Francisco and Shanghai. They only played the one time. I thought about putting that on the list because it was one of those more of a hypothetical rivalries. It was more of an anticipated rivalry that never really developed. But to me, this was one of those true ones where you had those tournaments where the teams would go to Hawaii from North America. And it was exciting because you got games like this where the two best teams in the world on opposite sides of the country or opposite sides of the world are clashing, twice a tournament, once a tournament, just to see who's the best. And, it never always went the way you wanted it to, for Dallas and Shanghai. Sometimes you won, sometimes you lost. But it was really good, and the fans got to see it because you got to kind of see how the evolution of a tournament's worth of games would then translate to tournament success. It was really fun, really exciting, and certainly, I think, one of the things that made the 2021 season one of the best we ever had. This rivalry, Atlanta versus LA Gladiators, and the Seoul Dynasty versus the Philadelphia Fusion, all of those rivalries, in my opinion, were so good, and some of them were region-specific, some of them were not. But to me, it's one of the things that made 2021 such a phenomenal season, underrated season, in my opinion. I think it is arguably up there as one of the best seasons in the history of the Overwatch League. Really, really phenomenal. Give a lot of love to it for what it was able to do and how it was able to really make a lot with kind of not the best situation possible. And this rivalry, to me, really was the one that drove that 2021 season. At number 3, I have the San Francisco Shock Vancouver Titans rivalry from 2019. It was the GOATS era. It was the GOATS meta. It was the rivalry to end all rivalries. Phenomenal, phenomenal matches between these teams time and time again. And it really was interesting to see how these teams played consistently over and over and over again. They met, of course, I believe a total of 5 times. They met once in Stage 1 during the regular season, and then again in the Stage 1 finals, which the Titans won both of those games. Then they met again in the Stage 2 finals. Shock were able to win that one after their undefeated stage. Stage 4 comes around. They meet again for the 4th time, with the victory going the way of the Shock. And it's set up for the final match in the grand finals. Those two teams met up, and it was once again the Shock victorious. Lost the first 2, won the last 3, and it was the rivalry. Everybody knew in 2019 those two teams were on a collision course to the grand finals. Once Stage 1 ended, maybe New York can do it. They look pretty good. They beat Shock in Stage 1, but once that Stage 1 finals came around and Stage 2 finals came around, it was clear that they were the best 2 teams in the world. They were the only 2 teams that really had any chance of hoisting that trophy. And you can't really deny just the overall level of play. They, GOATS is a controversial meta, of course, you hear about it all the time, but when these 2 teams played it, it was some of the best Overwatch you ever watched, right? It was phenomenal. The games were close, they were competitive, they were just phenomenal. You got to see really high-level coordination, and it was a really interesting kind of game to watch every time they played. And I think people who weren't around in 2019, who didn't see these games, I look back on GOATS maybe more fondly than some people do because I didn't play a lot of GOATS and I didn't watch contenders where it existed. I thought GOATS was really interesting, and I thought seeing how the deviations kind of worked from Stage 1 to Stage 2 to Stage 3, moving, the introduction of BAP, which really kind of helped the Shock, and then the Sombra meta comes through, which hurt the Titans the most, and that's kind of where I saw the rise of the Dragons, and then the 3-3-3 meta, or the 2-2-2 meta in Stage 4 that really changed things even further. It was a really interesting kind of season with these 2 teams. They were both phenomenal. They did a lot of really great things. And so everybody knew they were going to meet. And it was just phenomenal to watch. The games were great. I think that Stage 1 finals, in 2018 is one of my top 5 games in the history of the Overwatch League. I think it was such a phenomenal match. You really cannot overestimate how good that game was. It was so good, so competitive, so fun, so exciting. Such a great rivalry. I wish it would have lasted longer, of course. The Titans blew up their roster. Lots of changes. The Shock would continue on to be relatively successful for a long time. But nothing will ever be, I think, the one-season rivalry that was that 2019 rivalry. Best one-season rivalry we've ever seen. Spoilers for the rest of this list. And phenomenal. Super exciting games. Incredible matchup. Just great. At number 2, I have what I would argue is the best of the best when it comes to the geographic rivalries, and that is the Battle for Texas. I almost had this number 1, but it is down here at 2. Relatively competitive overall history. 15 games between them. Fuel won 8, Outlaws won 7. So very, very competitive. Pretty Fuel heavy in the big game category. They played in the May Melee twice. The Outlaws were undefeated, I think, in both of those games. They were undefeated in the regular season. Fuel won both of those games in the May Melee and June Joust in 2021. 2020, they played in the May Melee as well. That was the Decay game where he popped off. They also met the 2022 playoffs last year. Outlaws got 3rd place in the playoffs, kind of shockingly, but they did lose to the Fuel. And then this year, 2023, was the first time that the Outlaws won one of those big games against Dallas, and it was on the way for the Outlaws to go to the grand finals. So very fun rivalry. I think this is one of those ones that the two organizations did a very good job playing into the just history of this rivalry. They would play a lot of games on LAN whenever they could, even when other teams weren't. They tried to get these teams on stage as much as they could because it's just two teams that Houston and Dallas, that is a rivalry. That is Texas. That is a big state with a lot of big names and big history in sports. And it's just one of those ones where this is why when people ask me if I think that the location-based franchising was a bad idea for the Overwatch League, I will always say no. I think that it certainly was not done as well as it could. But you see a rivalry like the Battle for Texas or even the Battle for LA back in 2018, and you just see how much it means to the fans of those teams who get to literally go and watch their team play on stage, playing the other local team. There is something about that every person can relate to, no matter where you live in the world, right? If you live in the UK, you know how much you care when Manchester United and Manchester City play, right? Or Arsenal and Chelsea play. Like, those games matter because that's the crosstown rival, and I need to watch that other team lose because I feel better about my team when we beat the other team. And that game matters more than any other, even if it's not a Champions League game or anything like that. Even if one team is significantly better than the other, if we win that game as the worst team, it feels even better than if we're the better team. And it's that kind of history that I think makes games like this so important, and why I think the Battle for Texas was such a good rivalry, because it was historic. It was a lot of the same players year in and year out. Dante played in so many of them. And then you had the Dallas Fuel with their kind of Hanben Sparkle roster where they played in a lot of them. And it was really interesting to watch this rivalry develop over the years, where in 2018 it was two kind of middling teams, same thing in 2019. But as you moved into 2021, 2022, these teams were really good. And they were phenomenal teams that matched up really, really well against each other. So it was just a great rivalry to watch really develop, where it was not just, these are the two teams from Texas. It's, these are two really good teams in the league. These are actually two of the best teams in the world right now. And they're on collision courses multiple times a season. It was really phenomenal, really fun. Loved having it. One of the greatest rivalries in the history of the Overwatch League. But there is one that I think surpasses it. That rivalry, of course, is the Shanghai Dragons versus the Seoul Dynasty. I know I said that the number of games played and the length of the rivalry wouldn't be a factor one way or the other, but you cannot deny the fact that this rivalry, they played 28 times throughout the entirety of the Overwatch League. 16 of those games going the way of the Shanghai Dragons, 12 of them going the way of the Seoul Dynasty. It was such a phenomenal rivalry that had such incredible moments, and really the beginning of it was 2020. It really, the bulk of this rivalry was 2020, 2021, 2022. Obviously, 2018 Shanghai, not a very good team. 2023, Shanghai kind of had a very down year. 2019, both teams were decent, but I wouldn't say the rivalry really got its legs until 2020. It was really that May Melee Finals, the Shanghai Dragons reverse sweep against the Seoul Dynasty, the fearless revenge game, if you will, the fearless return, where he really supplanted himself and cemented his legacy as one of the greatest tanks of all time. It really began in that May Melee Finals, where he comes out and he wins 4 maps in a row, leading the Dragons to that reverse sweep victory. And of course, Fleta headshot after headshot after headshot. All-time great moment there. Lots of really great games between these teams. Of course, they played again in the 2020 playoffs. Dynasty, they beat the Fusion. They beat the Dragons. They make it to the grand finals. They spoil the Dragons' chance at revenge against the Shock. And then the 2022 kickoff clash, Dynasty managed to get a win over the Dragons on their way to their first tournament victory. It's just these two teams playing in the same region for as many years as they did. Really good, solid teams. You know, how many of those big games they had. They played so many playoffs and tournament games. It's just such a phenomenal rivalry. Plus, you have legends of the game on both sides. For a period of time with the Dynasty, you have Gesture and Prophet. Then you bring in Smurf. On the other side with Shanghai, you have Fearless and Lee Jae Gon and Izayaki and Lip and Fleta. You have these phenomenal names, and Void. And these rivalries just really highlight just talent. Best teams in the world at times. Best players coming out of South Korea competing, playing in these huge games time and time again. You don't get stuff like this all the time. You don't get stuff like this often. You look at this rivalry and the history between these teams, it's just hard to deny how important it is. And I think seeing that they played so many times, and it was a pretty competitive rivalry, not necessarily as competitive in the big games. 12 of those, wins went the way of the Dynasty. 4 of those are from 2018, so definitely not the perfect kind of example there where, of just how dominant Shanghai really was from 2020 to 2022. This to me is this is the premier rivalry in the history of the Overwatch League. The games were phenomenal, the storylines are phenomenal, the names and the legends behind it, unbelievable. I think I'm going to miss this rivalry the most of all of them. I just think this one had such great moments, and it was the thing that made the Eastern region unique in 2020, 2021, 22, 23, is that you just had these teams that played so often. They played a lot. And when you had good teams that played a lot, you got really good matches time and time again. And you got to have those rewards of the Dragons are the better team right now, but the Dynasty, they're going to push them. They compete every single time. And it was always nice to see the team that made the best teams in the world struggle. That made them sweat, pushed them. Maybe they didn't win all the time, but they pushed them. And when they finally got that win, it always made it more rewarding, more worth it. So this, to me, easily the best rivalry in history of the Overwatch League. I just cannot stress enough how amazing this one was. And I mentioned before that I think that Shock Titans Stage 1 Finals in 2018 or 2019 is one of the best top 5 games of all time. Yes, so is the 2020 May Melee between Shanghai and Seoul. I mean, that was unbelievable. One of the greatest matches of all time. One of the greatest Himi performances from Fearless. Just a great series. Just a great rivalry. And they easily, in my opinion, take the number 1 spot. So there we go. That is my list of the top 10 rivalries in the history of the Overwatch League. If you enjoyed this video and want more like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing for more content like it in the future. Obviously, it's been a little bit of a break since my last video. Lots of stuff going on in the Overwatch esports scene. I took a bit of a break, just life getting a little crazy, the holidays, all that type of stuff. But I wanted to make some videos, and this is the first, hopefully, of several kind of giving you my opinion on the history of some of the historic bests in the Overwatch League. I wanted to give a shout out here just at the end of the video to ATP Overwatch. He's been doing very similar content recently, and for years he's been doing a lot of videos like this. He does a lot of great work, and I think if you aren't somehow already subscribed to him, you should, because he's making really good content right now, all about the Overwatch League and history of the Overwatch League, and it's always a good watch. So just thought I'd shout him out for that. But that's going to be all for me for today. If you enjoyed this video, like I said, and want more like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing. But I'm going to get out of here. Thank you all once again. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. Hope you have a great holiday season. Hopefully I'll see you again before the end of the year. But until next time, bye-bye.